Hello, and welcome to another vlog. I read online the other day that Heinz, the makers of Heinz ketchup, will be releasing limited edition Cadbury cream egg mayo this Easter. So if anyone gets a chance to try it, let me know how it is. Anyway, today I'd like to talk a little bit about my good friend Keith Martin, who is an ambassador for Muscular Dystrophy Canada, an organization that you may remember me talking about quite frequently in previous videos. Now, Keith Martin was diagnosed with a form of muscular dystrophy called facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy back in October 2005. And he recently sent me a short write-up talking a little bit about his diagnosis and his experience with the disorder. So I'd like to read to you what he wrote. So Keith says, facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy, or FSHD, is a condition that primarily affects the shoulders and arms of the upper body, but in time affects muscles everywhere, including the lower body and the core. The level of physical impairment can vary significantly from individual to individual. FSHD is a genetic disorder for which there is no treatment available. Since my diagnosis, I have experienced difficulties including lifting my arms above my head, balance, slips, trips, and falls, and climbing stairs. Shortly after my diagnosis, I decided that I would take on the challenge of a lifetime, cycling across Canada. Partly, I wanted to show myself that I could complete this intense physical feat despite my physical limitations. In addition, I wanted to raise money and awareness for muscular dystrophy in support of Muscular Dystrophy Canada. In a team with 4 other friends, we cycled 7,800 kilometers from the Pacific to the Atlantic Oceans across all 10 provinces and raised over $150,000 for MDC. It was the experience of a lifetime. Since the ride, I have remained as physically active as possible. I play squash, do yoga, cycle, and more, all to my level of ability, of course. I am an MDC National Ambassador, speaking and organizing events across the country. I am a professional engineer who has returned to graduate school for a master's in engineering and renewable energy. I love to sing and practice public speaking. My physical capabilities have decreased since. I'm not as strong, my balance is worse, and I fall more often. Nothing physical is easier. But I try to focus on what I can do physically, career-wise, community-wise. And I am grateful for the people I have in my life and the experiences I have lived. Hopefully you have learned more about FSHD through my experience, and I hope you enjoy this week's vlog with Alex. So as you heard from Keith's testimony, shortly after he was diagnosed, he decided that he wanted to go on a cross-country bike ride across Canada, in part so that he could raise money for muscular dystrophy research, but more importantly so he could prove to himself and others that this was something that he could still do regardless of his diagnosis. So Keith got together with 4 of his friends, Jonathan Taves, Michael McDonald, Patrick Cuthbert, and Brian Sprague, and together they formed the Flying Five, and thus the Moving Muscles ride was born. So they began their journey in Tofino, British Columbia on May 13, 2008, and they kicked off their adventure by dipping their bike tires in the Pacific Ocean, and then they were off. Now, as you can imagine, they visited many different cities and attractions along their journey, and I'm just going to share with you some of the highlights. So one of their first stops was a small town in British Columbia called Port Alberni, and this was where they faced one of their first challenges, which was a very difficult climb of a very steep hill. But they managed to overcome that challenge, and then they made their way through the Thompson River Valley and the Rocky Mountains until they arrived in Lake Louise, Alberta. And then from there they headed to Calgary, Alberta. Now after they left Calgary, Alberta, they headed to another small town in Saskatchewan called Carinport. And it was here that they paid a visit to the students of Carinport High School and did a little bit of public speaking. And then from there they headed to Regina, Saskatchewan. Now it was after they left Regina that they faced their next big challenge, the Prairies. Now the Canadian prairies are very big and very flat. So you can imagine the amount of time and effort it took Keith and his friends to complete this leg of the journey. But they did complete this leg of the journey, and then they made their way to Winnipeg, Manitoba. From Winnipeg, they made their way to Thunder Bay, Ontario, and it was here that they paid a visit to the Terry Fox Monument. Now, Terry Fox was a well-known advocate for people with disabilities, who was diagnosed with a serious form of bone cancer. And like Keith and his friends, Terry did a cross-country trek across Canada to raise money and awareness for people affected by cancer. Unfortunately, his journey was cut short just outside Thunder Bay when he collapsed because his cancer returned. and he passed away shortly thereafter. But he still managed to raise millions of dollars for cancer research, and his legacy lives on to this day. So, as you can imagine, this was probably a very emotional experience for Keith and his friends, as they kind of had that intimate connection with Terry and Terry's journey, his marathon of hope. Anyway, once they left Thunder Bay, they went and did some camping. They passed through Abatongo Provincial Park, Lake Superior Provincial Park, and Balsam Lake Provincial Park. And then they made their way to a town called Sobel Beach in Ontario. And it was here that they joined in the town's Canada Day celebrations. And then from there, they headed to Ottawa, Ontario, our nation's capital. After leaving Ottawa, they headed to Quebec City in Quebec, where they joined in the city's 400th anniversary celebrations. Fun fact, Quebec City is actually the oldest city in Canada. Once they left Quebec City, they headed to a small town in New Brunswick called Bathurst before heading over the Confederation Bridge to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, and then they took a ferry to a small town in Nova Scotia called Antigonish before heading north to Cape Breton Island. And then there, they took another ferry all the way to St. John's, Newfoundland, where they completed their journey on August 5th, 2008, and once again dipped their bike tires, this time in the Atlantic Ocean. So they made their way from the Pacific coast all the way to the Atlantic coast. Like he said, they traveled 7,800 kilometers. Now, as you can imagine, they also participated in a lot of activities and events during their journey. There were interviews, there was public speaking, and they did some camping and houseboating, they did some bird watching, there were the Canada Day and Quebec anniversary celebrations that I mentioned, there were the ferry rides, and of course, they enjoyed a great deal of food and fellowship. So they really did have an eventful journey. But as you can imagine, as is usually the case, nothing ever goes the way you plan. So they did run into a few challenges along the way. One of the biggest challenges they faced was inclement weather, specifically wind and rain. And then the other challenge was difficult terrain. They had to, cross a lot of rough, muddy, steep terrain, kind of like I mentioned. And then the last challenge, of course, by the time they finished their journey, you can imagine they're very exhausted from their travels. But fortunately, they managed to overcome all of these challenges and they successfully completed their journey and they actually surpassed their goal of raising $150,000. But of course, this is not something that they could have done without the support of their friends, family, and all the people they met along the way. And of course, they couldn't have done it without each other. So that's just a quick rundown of the Moving Muscles ride. Obviously, these are just the highlights of the journey. There's a lot more things that happened along the way that I left out because I just don't have time to include them in a 10-minute vlog. But I will include a link in the description to movingmusclesride.ca where you can learn a little bit more about their adventure and read their travel blog where they go into a lot more detail about their trek. And I'll also include a link to the Flying 5 book, which talks all about the Moving Muscles ride for anyone who wants to purchase that book, which, speaking from experience, is a really good book. I read it myself, and it's actually what inspired me to do today's vlog. So I'm going to be releasing another video later this week in which I'll talk more about FSHD, what it is, what the symptoms are, and how it's treated. So be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see that video. And as always, if you enjoyed today's vlog and you want to see more videos like this one, then please support me on Patreon. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you soon.